The languages of Scotland. Of the languages spoken or once spoken in Scotland, each of the numerous languages spoken in Scotland during its recorded linguistic history falls into either the Germanic or Celtic language families. The classification of the Pictish language was once controversial, but it is now generally considered a Celtic language. Today, the main language spoken in Scotland is English, while Scots and Scottish Gaelic are minority languages. The dialect of English spoken in Scotland is referred to as Scottish English. Celtic languages. The Celtic languages of Scotland can be divided into two groups, Gaelic and Brittonic. Pictish is usually seen as a Brittonic language, but this is not universally accepted. They are known collectively as the Insular Celtic languages. Gaelic languages. The Gaelic language currently spoken in Scotland is Scottish Gaelic. It is widely spoken in the Outer Hebrides, and also in parts of the Inner Hebrides and Scottish Highlands, and by some people in other areas of Scotland. It was formerly spoken over a far wider area than today, even in the recent past, as evidenced by place names. Galwegian Gaelic is the extinct dialect of Scottish Gaelic formerly spoken in southwest Scotland. It was spoken by the independent kings of Galloway in the time, and by the people of Galloway and Carrick until the early modern period. It was also once spoken in Annandale and Strathnairn. Scottish Gaelic, along with modern Manx and Irish, is descended from Middle Irish, a derivative of Old Irish, which is descended in turn from Primitive Irish, the oldest known form of the Gaelic languages. Primitive Irish is known only from fragments, mostly personal names, inscribed on stone in the Ogham alphabet in Ireland and Western Britain up to about the 6th century AD. Gaelic languages were once the most prominent by far among the Scottish population, but are now mainly restricted to the west. The Burla Rigard is a Gaelic-based cant of the Scottish travelling community related to the Shelter of Ireland. The majority of the vocabulary of modern Scottish Gaelic is native Celtic. There are a large number of borrowings from Latin, Ancient Greek, especially in the religious domain, Norse, Hebrew, French and Lowland Scots. In common with other Indo-European languages, the neologisms which are coined from modern concepts are typically based on Greek or Latin. Although written in Gaelic orthography, television, for instance, becomes television and computer becomes computer. Although native speakers frequently use an English word for which there is a perfectly good Gaelic equivalent, they will, without thinking, simply adopt the English word and use it, applying the rules of Gaelic grammar as the situation requires. With verbs, for instance, they will simply add the verbal suffix "-anteli", rather than "-tamiak" or "-imheder" and "television". This tendency was remarked upon by the minister who compiled the account covering the parish of Stornoway in the New Statistical Account of Scotland, published over 170 years ago. It has even gone so far as the verb backdated. However, as Gaelic medium education grows in popularity, a newer generation of literate Gaels is becoming more familiar with modern Gaelic vocabulary. The influence of Scottish Gaelic can be seen particularly in surnames and toponymy. The surname influence is not restricted to Mac names. Several colours give rise to common Scottish surnames. Ban, Rua, Dove, Don, Bidhay, and Jell gives rise to names such as Gilmore and Gillies. Common place name elements from Gaelic in Scotland include Belly, G, Balerno, Killary, Kilmarnock, Inveri, G, Inverness, Innerlithen, Cian E, G, Cantar, Kinross and Dun E, G, Dundee and Dunfermline. Brittonic languages. None of the Brittonic languages of Scotland survive to the modern day, though they have been reconstructed to a degree. The ancestral Common Brittonic language was likely spoken in southern Scotland in Roman times and earlier. It was certainly spoken by the early medieval era, and Brittonic-speaking kingdoms such as Strathclyde, Reged, and Gododin, part of the Hen Ogledd, emerged in what is now Scotland. Eventually Brittonic evolved into a variety known as Cambric, which survived in southwestern Scotland until around the 11th century. The main legacy of these languages has been Scotland's toponymy, e.g., names such as Aberdeen, Tranent and Ochiltree. There are also many Brittonic influences on Scottish Gaelic. Scottish Gaelic contains a number of apparently P-Celtic loanwords, but as Q-Celtic has a far greater overlap with P-Celtic than with English in terms of vocabulary, it is not always possible to disentangle P and Q-Celtic words. However, some common words, such as Mynad Welsh Mynid, Cambric * Moni, are particularly evident. Often the Brittonic influence on Scots Gaelic is indicated by comparing with the Irish Gaelic usage, which is not likely to have been influenced so much by Brittonic. In particular, the word Strath is a native Goidelic word, but its usage appears to have been modified by its Brittonic cognate Estrad, whose meaning is slightly different. Pictish language. The Pictish language is generally understood to be an insular Celtic language. At its height, it may have been spoken from Shetland down to Fife, but it was pushed back as Scots, Britons, and Anglo-Saxons invaded northern Britain, each with their own language. Brittonic may have been a precursor of Pictish. Germanic languages. Two West Germanic languages in the Anglic group are spoken in Scotland today, Scots and Scottish English, a dialect of the English language. The Norn language, a North Germanic language, is now extinct. The Northumbrian dialect of the Old English language was spoken in the Anglian Kingdom of Northumbria from the Humber estuary to the Firth of Forth. The Viking invasions of the 9th century forced the dialect to split in two, and in the north it began to evolve into Scots. Scots language. Scots has its origins in the variety of early Northern Middle English spoken in southeastern Scotland, also known as Early Scots, that began to diverge from the Northumbrian variety due to 12th and 13th century immigration of Scandinavian-influenced Middle English speakers from the North and Midlands of England. Later influences on the development of Scots were from Romance languages via ecclesiastical and legal Latin, Norman and later Parisian French due to the Old Alliance, as well as Dutch and Middle Low German influences due to trade and immigration from the Low Countries. Scots also includes loanwords resulting from contact with Scottish Gaelic. Early medieval legal documents include a body of Gaelic legal and administrative loanwords. Contemporary Gaelic loanwords are mainly for geographical and cultural features, such as Cayley, Loch and Clan, and also occur in colloquialisms such as Gob and Jill. For the 13th century, early Scots spread further into Scotland via the burghs, early urban institutions which were first established by King David I. The growth in prestige of early Scots in the 14th century, and the complementary decline of French in Scotland, made Scots the prestige language of most of eastern Scotland. By the 16th century, Middle Scots had established orthographic and literary norms largely independent of those developing in England. Modern Scots is used to describe the language after 1700, when Southern Modern English was generally adopted as the literary language. There is no institutionalized standard variety, but during the 18th century a new literary language descended from the old court Scots emerged. This variety abandoned some of the more distinctive Old Scots spellings, adopted many standard English spellings, and introduced what came to be known as the apologetic apostrophe, generally occurring where a consonant exists in the standard English cognate. This written Scots drew not only on the vernacular but also on the King James Bible, and was also heavily influenced by the norms and conventions of Augustan English poetry. Consequently, this written Scots looked very similar to contemporary Standard English, suggesting a somewhat modified version of that, rather than a distinct speech form with a phonological system which had been developing independently for many centuries. This modern literary dialect, Scots of the Book, or Standard Scots, once again gave Scots an orthography of its own, lacking neither authority nor author. During the 20th century, a number of proposals for spelling reform were presented. Commenting on this, John Corbett writes that devising a normative orthography for Scots has been one of the greatest linguistic hobbies of the past century. Most proposals entailed regularizing the use of established 18th and 19th century conventions, in particular the avoidance of the apologetic apostrophe. Spoken Scots comprises many dialects, none of which may be said to be more true Scots than any other. This diversity is often seen as a mark of local pride among Scots. There are 4 dialect groupings: Insular Scots spoken in Orkney and Shetland, Northern Scots spoken in Caithness, east to Rossmore, Aberdeenshire and Angus, Central Scots spoken in the central lowlands and southwest Scotland, and Southern Scots spoken in the Scottish borders and Dumfriesshire. A Jewish hybrid of the early 20th century is Scots Yiddish. Scottish English is the result of language contact between Scots and the Standard English of England after the 17th century. The resulting shift towards Standard English by Scots speakers resulted in many phonological compromises and lexical transfers, often mistaken for mergers by linguists unfamiliar with the history of Scottish English. Furthermore, the process was also influenced by interdialectal forms, hypercorrections and spelling pronunciations. Highland English has been influenced by Gaelic, the most Gaelic-influenced variety being Hebridean English, spoken in the Western Isles. Distinct vocabulary, often from Latin and Lowland Scots, is still used in Scottish legal terminology. Norn language. Norn is an extinct North Germanic, West Scandinavian language that was spoken on Shetland and Orkney, off the north coast of mainland Scotland, and in Caithness. Norn evolved from the Old Norse that was widely spoken in the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland and the west coast of the mainland during the Viking occupation from the 8th to the 13th centuries, after the Northern Isles were ceded to Scotland by Norway in the 15th century. Its use was discouraged by the Scottish government and the Church of Scotland, and it was gradually replaced by Lowland Scots over time. Norn persisted well into the 19th century, as the Faroese linguist Jacob Jakobsen wrote. As late as 1894, there were people in Fowler who could repeat sentences in Norn, as I myself had the opportunity of hearing. The last man in Unst who was said to have been able to speak Norn, Walter Sutherland from Score, died about 1850. In Fowler, on the other hand, many who were living very much later than the middle of the present century are said to have been able to speak Norn. Most of the use of Norn, Norse, in modern-day Shetland and Orkney is purely ceremonial, and mostly in Old Norse. For example, the Shetland motto, which is Methlogum skal land bygge, which is the same motto used by the Icelandic police force and inspired by the Danish Codex Holmiensis. There are some enthusiasts who are engaged in developing and disseminating a modern form called Nynorn, based upon linguistic analysis of the known records and Norse linguistics in general. Norman French, Ancient Greek and Latin. Latin is also used to a limited degree in certain official mottos, for example nemo me impune lacessit, legal terminology, and various ceremonial contexts. Latin abbreviations can also be seen on British coins and in mottos etc. The use of Latin has declined greatly in recent years. At one time, Latin and Ancient Greek were commonly taught in Scottish schools, and Scottish hires are still available in both subjects. Latin's presence is almost 2,000 years old in Scotland, but it has rarely been a community language. Norman French was historically used in Scotland, and appears in some mottos as well. Some works of medieval literature from Scotland were composed in this language. After the 12th century reign of King David I and the so-called Davidian Revolution, the Scottish monarchs are perhaps better described as Scoto-Norman than Gaelic, are often preferring French culture to native Scottish culture. A consequence was the spread of French institutions and social values, including canon law. The first towns, called burghs, appeared in the same era, and as they spread, so did the Middle English language. These developments were offset by the acquisition of the Norse Gaelic West, and the Gaelicization of many of the noble families of French and Anglo-French origin, and national cohesion was fostered with the creation of various unique religious and cultural practices. By the end of the period, Scotland experienced a Gaelic revival, which created an integrated Scottish national identity. The use of Ancient Greek is almost entirely gone in Scotland, but one example would be the motto of St Andrews University: Alpha Iota Epsilon Nu Alpha Rho Iota Sigma Tau Epsilon Upsilon Epsilon Iota Nu. Sign languages. Scotland's deaf community tends to use British Sign Language. There are a few signs used in Scotland which are unique to that country. Many of Scotland's deaf were educated at Donaldson's College. Other sign languages in use in Scotland include Makaton and Signed English, a sign language based on the English language. Controversies. Language versus dialect. There are no universally accepted criteria for distinguishing languages from dialects, although a number of paradigms exist, which render sometimes contradictory results. The exact distinction is therefore a subjective one, dependent on the user's frame of reference. Scottish Gaelic and Irish are generally viewed as being languages in their own right rather than dialects of a single tongue, but are sometimes mutually intelligible to a limited degree, especially between southern dialects of Scottish Gaelic and northern dialects of Irish. But the relationship of Scots and English is less clear, since there is usually partial mutual intelligibility. Since there is a very high level of mutual intelligibility between contemporary speakers of Scots in Scotland and in Ulster, and a common written form was current well into the 20th century, the two varieties have usually been considered as dialects of a single tongue rather than languages in their own right. The written forms have diverged in the 21st century. The government of the United Kingdom recognizes that Scots and Ulster Scots meet the Charter's definition of a regional or minority language. Whether this implies recognition of one regional or minority language or two is a question of interpretation. Ulster Scots is defined in legislation Northern Ireland Order 1999 as the variety of the Scots language which has traditionally been used in parts of Northern Ireland and in Donegal in Ireland. Hostility. Some resent Scottish Gaelic being promoted in the lowlands, although it was once spoken everywhere in mainland Scotland except the extreme southeast and the extreme northeast. two areas with mostly Norse-derived place names. The Northern Isles were ceded to Scotland in lieu of an unpaid dowry in 1472, and never spoke Gaelic, its traditional vernacular Norn, a derivative of Old Norse mutually intelligible with Icelandic and Faroese, died out in the 18th century after large-scale immigration by lowland Scots speakers. To this day, many Shetlanders and Orcadians maintain a separate identity, albeit through the Shetlandic and Orcadian dialects of lowland Scots, rather than the former national tongue. Norn was also spoken at one point in Caithness, apparently dying out much earlier than Shetland and Orkney. However, the Norse-speaking population were entirely assimilated by the Gaelic-speaking population in the Western Isles. To what degree this happened in Caithness is a matter of controversy, although Gaelic was spoken in parts of the county until the 20th century. Overview. Diagrammatic representation of the development of the historic Indo-European languages of Scotland. Statistics. According to the 2001 census, Scottish Gaelic has 58,652 speakers. In total, 92,400 people aged 3 and over in Scotland had some Gaelic language ability in 2001. 15,723 of these reside in the Outer Hebrides, where the language is spoken by the majority of the population. There are also large populations of speaker in other parts of the Highlands. A Scottish government study in 2010 found out that 85% of Scotland's adult population speaks Scots. However, according to the 2011 census, 1,541,693 people can speak Scots in Scotland, approximately only 30% of the population. The Romani language has also been spoken in Scotland, but became more or less extinct in the country during the 20th century. It has lent Scotland's other languages a number of loanwords, and has also had an effect on the Gaelic of the travelling community. Since the beginning of the 21st century, increasing numbers of Romani migrants has seen the Romani language return to Scotland. The Govan Hill area in Glasgow has become home to many Romani people, and the Romani language can be heard being spoken in the area. During the 20th and 21st centuries, immigrants from a wide variety of countries have created a complex mosaic of spoken languages amongst the resident population.